Kill them. Kill every single one of them. Leave nothing behind. The insurgent commander's voice crackled across the radio, cold, certain, without a trace of hesitation. He had 50 fighters surrounding 6 trapped Americans. One was already bleeding out on the ground. The others were completely out of ammunition, pinned against a ravine wall with nowhere to run. He raised his fist and drove it downward, the signal to advance and execute. 30 seconds. That was all those 6 Americans had left before 50 armed men closed in and erased them completely. Nobody in Washington knew. No rescue was coming, but someone heard that order, and she was already moving. Before we go any further, if stories like this move you, please subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see just how far the story has traveled. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The mountains of Zabul province do not forgive mistakes. They never have. Not for the Soviet soldiers who bled into the same soil 30 years before. Not for the Afghan farmers who scratched at the earth trying to grow something in a land that seemed to resent life itself. And certainly not for the American warriors who kept returning year after year, believing that this time this mission might finally mean something. Chief Petty Officer Thomas Beckett had been to Afghanistan 4 times. He knew what these mountains were. He knew what they could do to a man, how they could swallow a patrol whole, how the terrain could turn a straightforward operation into a funeral before the sun had even finished rising. He knew all of that. He respected it. And on the morning of August 14, 2018, he led his 6-man SEAL Team 4 Element into those mountains anyway, because that was the job. And Thomas Beckett had never once in his career walked away from the job. The mission briefing had been clean, almost too clean looking back on it later. A suspected Taliban logistics coordinator had been tracked to a series of compounds in the eastern ridgeline of the province. The intel suggested a small security element, no more than 15 fighters. Go in fast, grab the target, exploit whatever documents and devices they could find, get out before anyone even knew they had been there. Simple. Surgical. The kind of mission that SEAL Team 4 had executed dozens of times across multiple deployments. Beckett had stood in that briefing room and listened to the intelligence officer walk through the operational picture, and something had nagged at him. Something he couldn't quite name. A tightness in the back of his skull that he'd learned over the years to take seriously. He'd turned to his senior enlisted advisor, Master Chief Roland "Gunny" Devers, after the briefing cleared out, and he'd said 3 words that would stick with Gunny for the rest of his life. "This feels thin." Gunny had looked at him with those flat, expressionless eyes that 22 years of combat had carved into his face, and he'd said, "Always does, Chief, always does." They'd inserted by helicopter 2 hours before dawn, dropped into a narrow valley floor, 3 kilometers from the objective, and begun their approach on foot. The terrain was brutal, even by Afghan standards, loose shale that shifted under every footfall elevation, that punished the longest darkness, that turned every shadow into a potential threat. They moved in silence the way SEALs move, with a kind of disciplined patience that looks almost casual until you realize how much calculation is happening behind every step. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Hayes was on point. Hayes was 26 years old and had the kind of quiet intensity that made even experienced operators pay attention. He moved through terrain like water finding its path, not forcing it, not fighting it, just reading it and flowing through. Beckett had watched him operate for 2 deployments and had privately concluded that Hayes might be the finest natural tactician he'd ever served with. Behind Hayes came Petty Officer Second Class Danny "Doc" Miller, the team's medic, a man whose bedside manner consisted of telling wounded operators to stop complaining and move faster. Doc Miller had kept 3 men alive on a previous deployment when by every medical standard they should have died, and he carried that knowledge with a kind of quiet arrogance that nobody on the team resented because he'd earned it. Then came Petty Officer First Class Jerome Rome, Washington heavy gunner, carrying the M249 SAW plus 400 extra rounds in enough additional kit to make most men buckle at the knees. Rome never seemed to notice the weight. Rome had grown up in a neighborhood in Baltimore where simply surviving to adulthood required a particular kind of toughness, and he had transferred that toughness into the SEAL teams with a directness that was almost refreshing. What Rome thought, Rome said. What Rome saw, Rome dealt with. No complications. Petty Officer Third Class Aaron "Tiny" Kowalski, 6'4", 240 pounds, nicknamed with the particular Navy SEAL brand of irony, served as the team's breacher and assistant and gunner. He was 24 years old and had been on his first combat deployment. He was the youngest member of the element, and he compensated for that by working harder than anyone else and complaining about it less. Petty Officer Second Class Luis Ghost Ortega handled communications. The nickname had come from his ability to make himself disappear in any social situation, at a team barbecue, at a post-mission debrief, anywhere outside of actual combat. Ghost seemed to evaporate. But on a radio under fire with chaos happening all around him, Ghost became the clearest, most precise communicator any of them had ever heard. His voice never changed, not when things were going well, not when things were falling apart. Ghost's voice on the radio was the same regardless, and that steadiness had saved lives before. And then there was Petty Officer First Class Kevin Briscoe Beckett's second-in-command, a solid, methodical operator from rural Tennessee who approached combat problems the way a carpenter approaches a structural problem, methodically without panic, looking at what needed to be done and figuring out the most efficient way to do it. Bricks had a wife named Claire and twin daughters named Lily and Rose, who were 7 years old. And he carried their photograph in the left breast pocket of his plate carrier, close to his heart, and he had not told anyone on the team about this because he was Thomas Briscoe, and Thomas Briscoe did not discuss such things in mixed company. 6 men. 6 of the finest human beings the United States military had ever produced, moving through Afghan darkness toward an objective that intelligence had assessed as manageable. The first indication that something was catastrophically wrong came from Hayes. He stopped. Not gradually, not hesitantly, he stopped the way a man stops when his body recognizes danger before his conscious mind can process it. One moment moving, the next absolutely still, his right fist coming up in the signal that needed no words. Everyone froze. Beckett moved up to Hayes's position in a crouch, slow and silent. He pressed close and whispered directly into Hayes's ear, barely more than a breath, "What do you have?" Hayes didn't look at him. He was staring into the darkness ahead, into a section of ravine that the terrain should have made impassable. "Movement," he whispered back. "Too much movement. Multiple positions." Beckett looked. He used the patience he'd spent 15 years developing the ability to slow his own perception down and let the darkness give up its secrets. And slowly, over the course of about 40 seconds, the darkness did exactly that. There were shapes in the ravine. Not one shape, not two, multiple shapes arranged in a pattern that Beckett had studied in training and had hoped never to see in reality. They were distributed across the terrain in an L-shaped configuration, one element blocking the forward route, another position perpendicular to the team's line of advance. It was a classic ambush geometry textbook, and whoever had set it up had done so with a professionalism that stopped Beckett's blood cold. This wasn't 15 fighters. The L-shaped ambush they were looking at required minimum 30 to 40 personnel to execute effectively. To create the overlapping fields of fire Beckett was observing to cover all potential withdrawal routes, with the precision he could see, even in the darkness, you needed numbers. You needed training. You needed coordination. The intelligence briefing had told him 15 fighters. Maybe. What was actually waiting for them in that ravine was an entirely different category of problem. Beckett pulled back to where the rest of the team had gone to ground, and he got them all close enough that he could barely whisper and still be heard. "L-shaped ambush," he said. "Forward and right flank. Minimum 30 personnel, possibly significantly more. They're waiting for us to walk into it." Rome's jaw tightened. Doc Miller's face went very still. Ghost was already reaching for his radio handset with the careful, deliberate motion of a man who understood that what happened in the next 60 seconds might determine whether they lived or died. "Options," Bricks said quietly. Beckett had been running them in his head since Hayes stopped. "Retrograde isn't clean," he said. "They may have coverage behind us. If we move back the way we came, we could be walking into a secondary element designed to catch retrograders." He paused. "We can try to flank left, get above them, use the high ground to..." That was when it happened. The ambush triggered. Not because they'd been seen, not because they'd made a sound, but because whoever was commanding that insurgent force was good enough to know that even a perfectly positioned ambush loses its advantages if it waits too long. The human element starts to drift. People get cold or nervous or impatient. A good commander knows when to spring the trap, and whoever was on the other end of those insurgent radio calls was a very good commander. The night exploded. Machine gun fire came from 3 directions simultaneously. RPGs arced across the darkness, trailing fire. Beckett heard the distinctive crack thump of incoming rounds, the crack of the bullet passing close, the thump of the discharge following behind, and he was moving before conscious thought engaged, throwing himself left toward the only terrain feature that offered any kind of cover. A shallow depression behind a rock outcropping that wasn't nearly large enough for 6 men, but was the only thing available. Contact left, contact front, contact right. Hayes was calling it out as he moved professional, even in the chaos, giving information, even while his body was executing survival protocols. Get to the ravine wall, Beckett was shouting now, the time for whispers, over the only priority, getting his team to something that could stop bullets. Left side, move, move. They moved. Under fire across open ground with rounds coming in from multiple directions, 6 SEALs covered 40 meters in the kind of controlled cast that training makes possible when nothing else does. Tiny took a grazing hit to his left shoulder that tore through the outer layer of his plate carrier and left a furrow across his skin that would bleed impressively, but wasn't life-threatening. He kept moving. Doc Miller stumbled over a rock in the darkness and went down hard, losing his night vision device, but was back on his feet in under 2 seconds. Ghost was running and transmitting, simultaneously his voice carrying that same impossible steadiness, even as rounds kicked up earth all around him. They made the ravine wall. It gave them something. Not much. The ravine wall was a slope of loose shale and exposed rock that offered cover from the front, but nothing from the elevated positions to their right, where at least one machine gun had established a firing position. But it was something, and something was all they had. Beckett pressed himself against the rock and took stock. 1 wounded, Tiny mobile, not critical. All 6 accounted for. Enemy fire still heavy from 3 directions. He grabbed Ghost's collar and pulled him close. What's our air picture? Ghost's expression gave it away before the words came. Working on it, Chief. Q. RF is 20 minutes out. Air support. He paused, listening to something in his earpiece. All fast movers are committed to another TIC in Helmand. They're pulling from Kandahar, but that's... How long? Ghost looked at him. Minimum 45 minutes. 45 minutes. Beckett processed that against the volume of fire coming down on their position, against the size of the force he'd observed, against the ammunition status his team was carrying. A standard SEAL element on a target mission loaded for a specific threat, they were not carrying the kind of ammunition load that could sustain a firefight against 50 fighters for 45 minutes. He keyed his own radio. Actual, this is Kilo 4. We are in contact, say again, in contact, L-shaped ambush. Significant enemy force estimated 50-plus personnel. 1 urgent, requesting immediate QRF and air support, over. The response from the Joint Operations Center was what he expected. Acknowledgement, assets being scrambled. Estimated support timeline beyond 45 minutes. 45 minutes. He looked at his team. Rome was laying down suppressive fire with the SAW burning through ammunition at the rate the situation demanded. Hayes was shooting disciplined single shots from a flanking position, trying to degrade the enemy's heavy machine gun. Doc was pressed in next to Tiny, one hand keeping pressure on the shoulder wound, his other hand free and ready. Bricks was coordinating fields of fire without being told, because Bricks always knew what needed to be done. Ghost was on the radio, still transmitting, still trying to pull assets from a system that didn't have assets to give. 3 minutes into the firefight, Rome tapped out his 3rd and final drum magazine. He looked at Beckett with an expression that didn't need interpretation. Running dry. Hayes' M4 ran empty. He dropped the mag, reached for a reload, and came up with the second-to-last magazine he was carrying. Tiny's rifle had been damaged in the initial movement, the optics shattered by a near miss, the barrel slightly bent. Usable at close range, marginal at anything beyond 30 meters. The mathematics of their situation were becoming impossible. Enemy ammunition unlimited or near enough to make no difference. Enemy personnel 50-plus against their 6. Enemy coordination professional, adaptive, clearly under competent command. Friendly ammunition minutes remaining. Friendly air support 45 minutes minimum. Friendly reinforcement 20 minutes, assuming the QRF could even fight through to their position. This was the calculation that Beckett ran in those compressed, terrible seconds. And the answer the calculation produced was one that he had never in his career expected to face. They were going to be overrun. Not might be, not possibly. The numbers said it plainly, without sentiment, without the kind of false hope that the mind tries to inject when reality becomes unacceptable. The numbers said you are going to run out of ammunition before help arrives, and when that happens, 50 insurgents are going to close on 6 positions, and this will end in a way that cannot be recovered from. Beckett had been in bad situations before. He had been in situations where the math looked terrible, and somehow through individual excellence and collective will, in the particular grace that sometimes visits men, in the worst moments, the math had been defied. He believed in that possibility. He had seen it happen. He was not a man given to despair, but he was a man given to honesty, and honesty demanded that he look at what his radio operator needed to do. He grabbed Ghost's arm. "Ghost." Ghost looked at him. "Broken arrow," Beckett said. The 2 words landed in the space between them with the weight of everything they meant. Broken arrow, the emergency distress code. The signal that said we are in extremis. We are beyond our capacity to continue. Every available asset, regardless of prior assignment, regardless of current operational commitment, regardless of whatever else might be happening anywhere else in the theater of operations, needed to be redirected. Now, immediately, without exception. Ghost held his gaze for a single second. Then he nodded, turned to his radio, and transmitted in that same flat, clear, impossible voice of his, all stations, this is Kilo 4. Broken arrow, broken arrow, broken arrow. We are black on ammo. Say again, black on ammo. 6 personnel, 1 urgent casualty under heavy contact enemy force 50 plus. Grid follows." He transmitted the grid coordinates. And then he said in that voice that never changed, that would never change no matter what happened next, "We need help." Rome had heard the call. Hayes had heard it. Doc Miller, Tiny Bricks, they had all heard it. The team continued fighting because SEALs continue fighting until they cannot, but something had shifted in the air between them. The broken arrow call was the admission of something that SEAL operators almost never admitted even to themselves, that the situation had exceeded them, that they were not in this moment sufficient, that they were human beings in need of rescue rather than elite warriors executing a mission. None of them showed it, none of them would. But they had all heard Ghost's voice go out over that frequency, clear and calm and desperate, in the way that only calm voices can be desperate, and they understood what it meant. From above and to the north in the darkness that covered the high ridges overlooking the valley, a frequency crackled in a set of headphones, and someone who had no business being anywhere near this battle heard every word. Beckett pressed himself against the rock and kept shooting because that was all there was left to do. The insurgents were maneuvering now, using the suppressive fire to bound forward, getting closer. The machine gun on the elevated right flank was walking rounds methodically toward the team's position, probing for the right angle. Someone down the line was shouting commands in Pashto, not panic. Commands, not the shouting of men in disorder, but clear, directed, confident commands from a man who knew exactly how this was going to end. "They're flanking left," Hayes called out. "I see it." Bricks responded, shifting position, taking fire from the new direction. "Tiny, can you move?" Beckett called. "I can move," Tiny said, and the set of his face suggested that the shoulder wound had reminded him it existed, but had not convinced him to stop fighting. "Rome, sit rep on ammo." "I am looking at my last box," Rome said, his voice carrying a weight that wasn't fear, but was something adjacent to it. "Maybe 3 minutes of sustained fire. Less if they push harder." 3 minutes. Ghost looked at Beckett. "No update from JOC. QRF is still 15 out. Air is still cool." A single shot rang out from somewhere above and to the north. It was a different sound from everything else on the battlefield. Heavier, more deliberate. The kind of sound that a precision instrument makes when it does exactly what it was designed to do. Somewhere up the slope in the darkness of the elevated terrain, an insurgent fighter who had been preparing to advance on the SEAL positions' left flank dropped and did not move. Nobody on the team had fired that shot. Beckett looked at Hayes. Hayes looked back at him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then a second shot. Same sound, same heavy, deliberate crack from somewhere impossibly far above them. Another insurgent, this one, the machine gun crew's assistant gunner, collapsed mid-movement. The machine gun fell silent. Beckett's brain was running hard, processing, trying to understand what was happening, because the alternative that there was someone out there somewhere on those ridges shooting with that kind of precision, from that kind of range on their behalf, was almost too large to accept. Rome had stopped firing, not because he'd run dry, not yet, but because the situation in front of him had changed in ways his experienced eye was still processing. The advance that had been tightening around them had stuttered. The coordinated movement was disrupting. Men who had been moving with purpose were now moving with confusion, looking in different directions, looking up at the ridges, looking for the source of something they couldn't identify. "What is that?" Tiny said quietly, as if afraid to say it too loud. "Someone's shooting," Hayes said, "from up high, way up high." "That's not QRF, Shay," Doc Miller said. "No," Beckett said, "that's not QRF." Another shot. Another insurgent commander collapsed mid-stride, his radio handset clattering on the shale. Below the ridge, in a position that 6 battered, exhausted, nearly out of ammunition SEALs were fighting to hold, Thomas Beckett looked up at the darkness of Ridge 814 and tried to understand what he was witnessing. The fire that had been closing around them, methodical, professional, 50 against 6, was breaking. Not from artillery, not from fast movers, not from QRF, from one rifle, one shooter. Somewhere above them, in a position nobody had assigned, carrying a load. Nobody had authorized, operating outside every protocol and beyond every parameter of her original mission. Someone had heard Ghost's voice on that frequency. Someone had come. Beckett pressed his back against the rock, stared up at the ridge he couldn't see, and said the only thing that made sense to say in that moment. "One shooter." His voice was barely above a whisper. "That's not QRF." He paused. "That's a ghost." And on Ridge 814, invisible against the terrain, breathing controlled and steady, eye pressed to the scope of a Macmillan TAC-3, 3-8 Chief Petty Officer Riley Harper exhaled and fired again. That third shot from Ridge 814 did something the 50 insurgents had not anticipated. It introduced doubt, and doubt in a coordinated assault is as deadly as any weapon. The commander's voice came back on the radio, sharper now, the confidence fractured at the edges. In Pashto, clipped and urgent, "Find the shooter, find where it's coming from. Now." His fighters were scanning the ridges, turning away from the 6 Americans they'd been advancing on, trying to locate something they couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't understand. The L-shaped ambush that had been executing perfectly 30 seconds ago was stuttering. Men who had been moving with purpose were frozen, looking up at darkness, waiting for something invisible to kill them. Down in the ravine, Thomas Beckett understood exactly what was happening, and it terrified him almost as much as the ambush had. Not because things were getting worse, because they were getting better in a way he couldn't explain, couldn't control, couldn't plan around. And in Beckett's experience, miracles on a battlefield had a way of ending. "Ghost," he said, pulling his radio operator close. "Get back on with JOC. Tell them we have an unknown friendly element engaging from the high ground north of our position. Unknown identity, unknown authorization, unknown status. Tell them I need to know who that is." Ghost was already transmitting before Beckett finished the sentence. Hayes had repositioned, using the momentary disruption in enemy fire to push 3 meters left to a better angle. He came back on the team internal net immediately. "Chief, they're pulling back from the left flank, not retreating but reorganizing. That shooter took their left flank element apart. I count at least 4 down, maybe 5. "How many does that leave us?" Beckett said. "Conservative estimate." Hayes paused. 45, maybe 43. Rome made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. 43. Outstanding. Better than 50. Tiny said from his position, his wounded shoulder pressed against the rock, his rifle up and his eyes still forward. "Marginally what the," Doc Miller said without looking up from the field dressing he was reinforcing on Tiny's wound. "Hold still." "I am holding still." "You're talking. Stop talking." Another shot from above. This one caught an insurgent who had been low crawling toward a position that would have given his team an enfilading angle on the SEAL's right side. The crawl stopped. The position was never reached. Beckett stared at the ridgeline. Whoever was up there was reading the battlefield in real time, not just shooting targets of opportunity, but systematically dismantling the architecture of the assault, taking commanders, taking crew-served weapon operators, taking the fighters who were maneuvering into the most dangerous positions. This wasn't random. This was someone who understood exactly what an L-shaped ambush looked like from the inside and was surgically removing its most critical components from the outside. That level of tactical awareness, combined with that level of shooting skill, narrowed the possibilities considerably. Ghost looked up from his radio. His voice carried something new in it, not quite confusion, but proximity to it. "JOC says they have no authorized element in our grid. No other friendly call signs within 8 kilometers. Beckett absorbed that. So whoever's up there, Bricks said from his position tracking an enemy fighter with his rifle, isn't supposed to be up there. No, Beckett said. They are not. And they're saving our lives anyway. Appears that way. Bricks fired. A fighter who had been trying to set up a PKM machine gun in a new position went down before he could get the weapon stable. Well, Bricks said, cycling his bolt, I'm choosing not to be upset about it. 11 minutes had passed since the ambush triggered. 11 minutes that felt like a geological era, compressed into frantic seconds and stretched across agonizing pauses. The QRF was still 9 minutes out. Air support was still 34 minutes from station. Rome had less than 90 seconds of ammunition remaining in the saw. Hayes was on his last magazine. The math hadn't changed, it had only been interrupted. And then the interruption almost ended. The insurgent commander had figured out the problem. He was good, genuinely professionally good, and it had taken him less than 4 minutes to adapt his entire tactical plan to account for the unknown shooter on the high ground. His new orders came through in a burst of Pashto that one of the JOC linguists would later translate and add to the classified report. Half the force continues suppression on the Americans. The other half goes up the North Ridge. Find the sniper and kill them. The Americans are already finished. They cannot escape, and they cannot fight much longer. The shooter on the ridge is the threat. Eliminate it. 25 fighters peeled away from the ambush and began moving toward Ridge 814. Neither Beckett nor anyone on his team could see this happening. They were still pinned, still dealing with the 20-plus fighters maintaining suppressive fire on their position. But Ghost had the linguist on the net now, and the linguist had been monitoring the enemy frequency, and the linguist's voice came through Ghost's earpiece with a controlled urgency that made Ghost's spine go straight. Kilo 4, be advised, enemy has split their force. Approximately half-estimated 25 personnel are now moving to locate and engage your unknown friendly element on the North Ridge. They know someone's up there. Ghost grabbed Beckett's arm and relayed it word for word. Beckett's face did something complicated. The person on that ridge, whoever they were, whatever they were doing there, had just become the primary target of 25 armed fighters. That person had come to save his team. That person was now in more danger than his team was. Can we reach them? Beckett said immediately. Do we have a frequency for the shooter on the ridge? Negative, Ghost said. We don't even know their call sign. JOC has nothing. There has to be a way. Chief, Ghost's voice was careful. If they're operating off the books, like JOC is suggesting, they may not be monitoring any of our standard frequencies. They heard us on the emergency net. That might be all we share. Beckett looked up at the ridge. 25 fighters were moving toward that position right now, and the person up there had no idea it was coming. They were still firing down into the valley, still working the ambush. Geometry still focused on the threat below, without knowing that an entirely new threat was climbing toward them from multiple directions. He grabbed the radio handset from Ghost and did something he almost never did. He broke protocol entirely and transmitted in the clear on the emergency frequency without code words or call signs. Unknown element on Ridge 814. This is SEAL Team element in the valley. You have 25 enemy fighters moving to your position from the south and west. Say again, 25 fighters closing on your location. You need to displace immediately. How copy? Static, nothing. Unknown element, please acknowledge. You are about to be flanked. 25 personnel. Moving now. More static. Beckett held the handset for 3 seconds that lasted significantly longer than 3 seconds, then handed it back to Ghost. He looked at his team. He looked at the ridge he couldn't see. And then he made the decision that he would spend years thinking about. We push, he said, every head turned toward him. What Rome said. We push, Beckett repeated. Whoever's up there came for us. We're not going to sit here and let them get killed for it. We push the remaining enemy force back, create separation, buy that shooter time to displace. Chief, Hayes said carefully, we are critically low on ammo, a push against 20 fighters. I know what it is, Beckett said. I'm not asking for opinions. Rome, how much do you have left? 40 rounds in the saw, maybe, and I mean maybe. Hayes, last mag, 28 rounds. Bricks, 11 rounds. Tiny, 15 roughly. Chief, my rifles. I know about your rifle. Doc, I don't fight Chief. I keep people alive. Ghost, Standard load, most of it gone. Beckett did the math in half a second. They had enough ammunition for approximately 45 seconds of sustained fire. What he was proposing was to use that ammunition in an offensive push rather than a defensive hold, which meant they would be out of ammunition faster in a more exposed position against an enemy that still had overwhelming numerical advantage. It was, by any conventional military analysis, a terrible idea. On my mark, Beckett said, because sometimes the terrible idea is the only idea that matters. What happened next lasted less than 60 seconds and felt like it lasted an hour. 6 SEAL operators running on empty magazines and the particular kind of determined fury that comes from having nothing left to lose burst from their position against a force that still outnumbered them 4-1. The shock of it, the sheer audacity of 6 men charging toward 20, created a half second of hesitation in the enemy fighters, and in combat, a half second of hesitation is an eternity. Rome burned through his remaining SAW ammunition in one sustained burst that walked across the enemy's front line and created chaos. Hayes put 6 shots into 6 separate targets with a precision that would be discussed in quiet professional settings for years afterward. Bricks moved left and drew fire covering Washington's advance, then used his body as a shield to protect Doc Miller, who was still keeping Tiny functional. Tiny bad shoulder and damaged rifle and all, managed to get close enough to a fighter who was repositioning that the distance made his weapon limitations irrelevant. The insurgent line buckled. Not broke, buckled. There's a difference. A broken line runs. A buckled line staggers, pulls back, tries to figure out what just hit it. It was enough. It was barely enough, and it cost them. Bricks took a round through his left forearm, a through and through that Doc would deal with in approximately 40 seconds of brutal efficiency. Ghost went down hard when a ricochet caught him across the helmet, leaving him dazed and on his knees for the most terrifying 12 seconds of Thomas Beckett's life before he shook it off and got back up. Hayes took shrapnel from an RPG that detonated 6 feet to his right, a pattern of hot metal fragments across his right leg that left him limping but functional. But they had created space. 50 meters of broken, contested, hard-won space between them and what remained of the enemy front element. And on Ridge 814, something else had happened entirely. Riley Harper had heard the transmission. Not clearly she'd been in a firing position. Noise of her own shots in her ears focused through the scope on a battlefield that was moving fast and getting faster. But she'd caught enough of it. Someone in the valley. Emergency frequency, 25 fighters, moving to her position. She pulled back from the scope and did what she'd been trained to do, and what her instincts had already begun doing before training had a chance to catch up. She counted. She assessed. She looked at her position with the eyes of someone who was now prey rather than hunter, and asked herself the question that determined everything. Can I hold this? The answer came back fast and honest, not against 25, not with the approach routes this position had, not if they came from 2 directions simultaneously, which is how she would have done it, which meant it's how they were going to do it. She needed to move. The problem was that moving meant leaving the overwatch position that was keeping 6 SEALs alive in the valley below. The moment she displaced the remaining enemy force down there, still 20-plus fighters would reorganize and resume the assault. And those 6 men were out of ammunition. She had heard that too. Black on ammo. She'd heard the broken arrow call. She knew exactly what their situation was. She looked down at the valley through her scope one more time. She found Beckett's position, or what she assessed to be Beckett's position based on the firing patterns she'd been observing. She could see them. 6 men in a depression holding a buckled enemy at bay but barely. The push they'd made had bought minutes, not many. She made her calculation the way she always made her calculations. Fast, honest, without sentiment. Move. Set secondary position. Cover the approach routes. Deal with the 25. Then return to Valley Overwatch, in that order. She broke down her position in 40 seconds. She moved. The first group of insurgent fighters reached her original hide site 3 minutes after she'd left it. They found her brass 9 spent cases from the TAC-3, 3-8 glinting in the early morning light. They found the impression in the ground where she'd lain. They found the ranging marks she'd scratched into a nearby rock. They found evidence of a sniper who had operated here with devastating effectiveness. They did not find her. Their commander got on the radio. The position is empty. The sniper moved. There was a pause and then a string of Pashto, that the linguist would later summarize as something between professional respect and genuine fear. This person moved without us hearing them. Find where they went. Split into 3 groups and sweep the ridge. 3 groups. The ridge splitting into 3 search elements moving in different directions, each one trying to find something that didn't want to be found. In the valley below, Beckett had heard Ghost relay the linguist's update. The enemy was hunting her now. The 25 fighters had reached her position and found it empty. They were sweeping. She moved, Hayes said. She's still up there, Beckett said. Not a question, a certainty. He didn't know why he was certain. He'd never met this person, didn't know their name, had no reason for the confidence he felt. But the certainty was there. How do you know, Doc said. Because if she'd been caught, Beckett said quietly, we'd know. Nobody asked him to elaborate. They all understood what he meant. 2 minutes of relative quiet followed. The remaining enemy fighters in the valley had pulled back, reorganizing, waiting for resolution on the ridge before resuming their assault. It was a tactical pause that everyone in Beckett's team knew was temporary. The moment the ridge question resolved one way or another, the valley assault would resume. Either their unknown protector would resume overwatch and continue suppressing the enemy, or the enemy would return to the valley with a clear picture and finish what they'd started. Ghost was working the radio constantly, a steady stream of updates to and from JOC, trying to get a clearer picture of the air support timeline, pushing for anything that could reach them faster. His voice remained flat and clear, despite the blood seeping from under his helmet where the ricochet had caught him. Doc had looked at it in a 3-second assessment and deemed it non-critical, which in Doc Miller's medical lexicon meant it wasn't immediately killing him, not that it didn't hurt. It hurt. Ghost chose not to mention this. Bricks had his left arm wrapped in a field dressing that Doc had applied with the aggressive efficiency of a man who viewed bleeding as a personal affront. The round had gone clean through the forearm missing bone by what Doc estimated as about 4 millimeters. Bricks was shooting with his right arm and treating the left arm as a logistical inconvenience. QRF updated ETA. Oh, Ghost said. 6 minutes. Air, Beckett said. Still 22. 6 minutes to QRF was something. 6 minutes to a reinforcing element that could change the numerical equation in the valley. But 22 minutes to air support was still a long time, and the enemy had not become less capable in the last 15 minutes. They had simply paused. Then the ridge came alive again. Not with a single careful shot, with something faster, closer, more urgent. The crack of a precision rifle, still the TAC-3 3.8 had a signature that you couldn't mistake once you'd heard it, but the intervals between shots had collapsed. Where before there had been seconds between each carefully placed round, now the shots were coming in pairs and sequences with barely a breath between them. She was no longer picking targets at range. She was in contact. She's engaged, Hayes said, and his voice carried something that was not quite reverence but was close. Beckett understood immediately. She'd found the 3 search elements before they'd found her, and she was dealing with them the way she'd dealt with every other problem this morning on her own terms, with her own weapons, according to a plan that nobody else knew and that appeared to be working. The shots from the ridge were fast, and they were accurate, and they were telling a story that Beckett could read even from 1,400 meters below. She was not running. She was fighting. Ghost, Beckett said. They said, get back on that emergency frequency. Ghost handed him the handset without a word. Unknown element, Ridge 814. This is Kilo 4. We hear you in contact. QRF is 6 minutes out. Air is 22. Hold if you can. We are coming to you as soon as we can move. How copy? For 4 seconds, nothing. Then for the first time, a voice came back through the static. Female, controlled, breathing harder than normal, but not much harder, which meant she was managing it, which meant she was still operational. Kilo 4, this is Ridge 814. I copy your QRF timeline. A pause. 2 shots fired audibly in the background of the transmission. I have 12, maybe 15 of them up here. 3 groups. I'm inside their perimeter now. They're looking outward, I'm inside. Tell your QRF I need them to come up the north face. South and west approaches are compromised. Beckett stared at his handset. She's inside their perimeter, he said. Did she just say she's inside their search perimeter? Tiny said. She did, Beckett said. Rome looked at the ridge for a long moment. That woman is out of her mind. Or she's the best operator any of us has ever seen, Hayes said. Can't those both be true, Doc said. Beckett keyed the handset again. Ridge 814 we copy. Passing your grid and status to QRF. Do you need anything? Another pause. More shots in the background closer now. I could use those 6 minutes to go a lot faster, she said. And then she went off the air and dealt with her situation and down in the valley. Thomas Beckett looked at his team, and his team looked back at him, and every one of them was thinking the same thing. They had come here as the finest warriors their country produced on a mission that was supposed to be routine, and they had ended up pinned and bleeding and nearly out of ammunition. And somewhere above them, single person who had no orders to be here, who had no backup, who had broken every protocol to show up in the right place at the right moment, was dealing with 15 fighters while telling them she could use some faster help. Ghost, Beckett said. Already on it, Ghost said. 5 minutes and 40 seconds until QRF. On the ridge, Riley Harper moved to her third position in 12 minutes and prepared for what was coming next. 5 minutes and 40 seconds. That was what Beckett had told her. That was the number Riley Harper carried with her as she moved to her third position in 12 minutes, her boots finding purchase on loose shale without making a sound, her body moving with the kind of controlled urgency that comes not from panic, but from a very precise understanding of how much time she had and how much she needed. She had been a sniper for 9 years. She had operated in 4 countries across 3 separate deployments. She had qualified as the top shooter in her class at every advanced course she had attended, and she had attended all of them. She had been told at various points in her career by various superior officers that she was extraordinary, exceptional, one of a kind, and she had accepted these assessments with the same flat professional acknowledgement she gave to everything else. Because compliments did not change the wind, and they did not close distance, and they did not make 15 fighters searching a ridge for her any easier to deal with. What she knew right now with the clarity that only real danger produces was this: she had 12 fighters to her south broken into 2 elements of 6. She had 3 fighters to her east who had separated from the main group and were moving faster than the others, which meant either they were more experienced or they were more frightened, and both possibilities made them more dangerous. She had relocated from her original firing position to a secondary high that she'd identified during her initial movement to the ridge, a position she'd chosen specifically because it offered a clear line to the approach routes most likely to be used by anyone coming up from the south. She had not chosen it because it was comfortable. She had chosen it because it was correct. The TAC 338 was a beautiful instrument. It weighed 16 pounds unloaded, which was not beautiful. But what it did at range was beautiful in the way that only functional perfection can be beautiful. She had carried it across 4 kilometers of mountain terrain to get here, along with her 80-pound pack, along with everything else she needed to operate independently for 72 hours. And she had not stopped once, because stopping would have meant arriving too late, and arriving too late was not an option she was willing to consider. She heard the first element before she saw them. 2 of the 6 were moving carelessly, too fast, too loud, the sound of men who had been hunting something for 15 minutes and had convinced themselves that what they were hunting was already gone. The other 4 were moving better. She tracked them by sound, first then by motion, and she built a picture of where they were and where they were going and where they would be in approximately 8 seconds. She settled into the position. She controlled her breathing the way she had controlled it 10,000 times in training, and a smaller but more significant number of times in actual contact. She found the first target through the scope. She calculated. She fired. The shot was loud in the pre-dawn quiet, and it did what it was supposed to do, and it also did something else. It told the remaining 11 fighters exactly where she was. Not approximately, exactly, because the second shot came from the same position 4 seconds later, and now they had a line, and they had a distance, and they had a direction. And 11 fighters with that information are a very different problem from 11 fighters without it. She displaced immediately. Not running on shale makes noise, and noise is a targeting solution. But moving fast and low and deliberate, 3 meters, left behind a rock that gave her a different angle and broke the sight line from her previous position. She heard them redirecting. She heard commands being called in Pashto, harsh and urgent, the sound of men who had been frustrated and were now focused. Good. Focused men move toward where they think you are. She was no longer where they thought she was. The next 2 shots came from the new positions 6 seconds apart, and after the second one, She moved again before the sound had finished echoing. This was the rhythm. She had established the pattern. She was forcing them to respond to fire, move, fire from the new position, move again. Never stationary long enough for them to triangulate, never predictable enough for them to get ahead of her. The problem was that this rhythm was burning time. Every displacement cost her seconds she could have spent shooting. And 11 fighters who knew her general location were compressing the search area with every movement they made, tightening the geometry of the ridge around her, making each displacement shorter and less effective than the last. 4 minutes until QRF. She heard it before she processed it consciously, a change in the pattern of movement to her east. The 3 fighters who had separated were not moving toward her anymore. They had stopped moving. Men who stop moving in a search either have a reason to stop, which means they've found something, or they have orders to stop, which means someone smarter than them is repositioning the search. She looked east through the scope, darkness still but thinning at the edges as the sky began its slow concession to morning. She found 2 of the 3 eastern fighters. Almost immediately, they had taken a position behind a rock formation that gave them a clear view of the approach routes she'd been using for her displacements. They weren't coming for her, they were waiting for her to come to them. Someone in the insurgent leadership had recognized the pattern. Someone had figured out that she was displacing in a predictable direction, always moving left from each position, always staying at roughly the same elevation. Someone had sent those 3 fighters to get ahead of her. She felt something that was not quite admiration, but was professionally adjacent to it. Whoever was commanding these fighters was adapting faster than she'd expected. She'd been assuming a certain level of tactical sophistication based on the earlier ambush geometry, but this using a small flanking element to get ahead of a moving sniper, while the main body compressed from the front, this was more advanced than she'd planned for. She stopped moving left. She went up. Climbing in combat kit with a 16-pound rifle and a pack that would have broken most people's backs was not something Riley Harper would have described as pleasant. She would not have described it at all, because describing it required thinking about it, and thinking about it was a luxury she did not have. She climbed, and because up was the only direction that hadn't been anticipated, because the 3 fighters to the east were watching the traverse line, and because the main body to the south was pushing along it and going up, broke both equations simultaneously. It cost her 30 seconds, 3.5 minutes until QRF. From the new elevated position, she could see more of the ridge than she'd been able to see before, and what she saw confirmed the picture she'd been building. The main body had split again, with 2 pairs maneuvering wide on either flank, while 2 fighters pushed directly up the center. It was a 5-element movement designed to give her no clean displacement route regardless of which direction she chose. It was well executed. It would have been a serious problem for almost anyone. For Riley Harper, it was a targeting solution. She put the scope on the center pair first because the center pair was the direction of most immediate pressure. First shot, second shot, the center push collapsed. The flanking elements stopped, which was exactly what she'd expected. When the center pair goes down, the flanking elements instinctively pause to reassess, because nobody wants to advance without knowing what just happened to the people in the middle. She used that pause to take the right flank pair while they were standing still. 4 shots, 4 targets, 7 fighters remaining, somewhere, 3 to the east watching a traverse she was no longer using. 4 to the south trying to figure out what had just happened to their 6 companions. The ridge had gone very quiet. She noticed the quiet the same way she noticed everything as information rather than as experience. The quiet meant the remaining fighters had stopped moving. Stop moving meant thinking. Thinking meant adapting. She had about 60 seconds before the new adaptation manifested in something she'd have to respond to. Her left arm was bleeding. She'd noticed it about 4 minutes ago and had not yet determined how it had happened. A ricochet probably there had been a close shot from the southern element about 2 minutes before her last displacement, and she'd felt something, but she'd been in the middle of a firing solution, and feeling something during a firing solution was information to be categorized and addressed later. Later was now. She looked at it for 2 seconds. A gash not deep, bleeding steadily, but not in the way that meant something important had been cut. She pressed it against her kit and felt the fabric take the pressure and moved on. The radio crackled. Ghost voice still impossibly steady. Ridge 814 QRF is 2 minutes out. They are on the north face, requesting you mark your position. She keyed her handset. Negative on position marker. I have unknown number of enemy elements on the ridge east and south of my position. A marker lights me up for them before it lights me up for QRF. Tell your QRF to move north and hold. I'll come to them. A pause. Then Beckett's voice, not Ghost's. He'd taken the handset directly. Negative Ridge 814. You do not come to them alone. What is your current status? She looked at her arm. She looked at the darkness around her, listening for the 7 fighters she couldn't see. She looked at the scope in the rifle and the 4 remaining magazines on her kit. I'm functional, she said. That is not what I asked. She almost smiled. Almost. I'm functional and I'm mobile. Left arm is superficial. I have 4 mags remaining. 7 enemy fighters on the ridge, unknown positions. I have one more thing to do up here before I can come down. What one more thing? She didn't answer that. She went off the air because the one more thing was happening right now, whether she was on the radio or not, and being on the radio while it was happening was a liability. The 3 Eastern fighters had moved. She'd heard it, the sound of men deciding that the silence had lasted long enough that whatever had happened to their companions needed to be answered. They were moving south, which meant they were trying to link up with the 4 remaining Southern fighters, which meant they were consolidating, which meant whoever was commanding them had assessed that their dispersed search formation had failed and was pulling them back into a tight element that could function as a unit rather than as scattered individuals. It was the right call. She would have made it herself. Their problem was that consolidating required movement, and movement was what she lived on. She found the first of the Eastern trio at 90 meters, which was close for attack 3-8, but she was no longer operating at range. She was operating in the space between their positions and hers in the compressed terrain of a ridge, where everything was closer than it should have been, and the margin for error was measured in heartbeats. She fired. She moved before the echo cleared. She found the second one at 70 meters, already stopping because he'd heard the shot, already beginning to go low, almost fast enough, almost. She fired. She was moving again. The third one was fast, genuinely fast, the kind of fast that meant training, real training, not the run and hope movement of a fighter who'd learned combat from a lifetime of low-level engagement. He went left when she expected him to go right, and he went down behind cover before she could get a clean solution. And for approximately 4 seconds, she was in a situation she hadn't been in since a training exercise in Nevada that she still didn't like thinking about. 4 seconds of her looking for him and him looking for her at 70 meters on a ridge in Afghanistan with 6 Americans alive in the valley below because of decisions she'd made in the last 20 minutes. He fired first, 2 rounds fast at an angle that suggested he had a partial picture of her position, but not a complete one. The rounds went high and left. She didn't move. Movement at this distance and this angle would define her position more precisely than staying still. She waited. He fired again. 1 round this time, lower, closer. He was adjusting. He had 2 more seconds before his adjustment was accurate enough to matter. She had 1 second before that. She found the muzzle flash from his second shot. She put the scope on the position. She fired. The ridge went quiet again. 1 minute, 40 seconds to QRF. She was breathing harder now. Not panicked breathing, controlled breathing. That was harder than normal because she was human, and she had been fighting for 23 minutes and her left arm was bleeding, and she had just spent 4 seconds in a situation that could have gone differently. She allowed herself exactly 3 breaths to acknowledge this, and then she was moving again north toward the sound of QRF vehicles grinding up the mountain. In the valley below, Beckett had heard the sequence of shots from the ridge, the pairs, the singles, the pause, the final shot. And he had been counting without consciously deciding to count. And when the counting stopped, he held the number in his head, and he did not say it out loud, because saying it out loud seemed like something he didn't have the right to do yet. Ghost had been on his radio constantly. The QRF element was on the north face and moving. The 4 remaining insurgent fighters in the valley had pulled back further when the shooting on the ridge had resumed, unsettled by whatever was happening above them, their coordination broken beyond recovery. The valley was not safe. It would not be safe until air arrived, but it was no longer the kill zone it had been 30 minutes ago. Doc was working. He was always working. Tiny shoulder bricks, his forearm, Ghost's head, the shrapnel across Hayes' leg. Doc Miller moved between his patients with the focused efficiency of a man who had decided some time ago that losing a patient was not something he was willing to do and had organized his entire professional life around that decision. Hayes' Doc said without looking up from what he was doing to Brix's arm. How's the leg? Fine, Hayes said. Define fine. Hurts. Functional. On a scale of 1 to 10. 4. Doc looked up briefly. You're lying. 6, Hayes said. Better. Doc went back to work. Don't move it more than you have to. Little late for that advice, Doc. It's always a little late. That's why I keep giving it. Rome had been watching the northern ridgeline without saying anything. He watched it the way he watched things when he was processing something that his brain needed time to work through. Finally, quietly, so that only Beckett heard it, he said, You think she's okay up there? Beckett looked at him. Rome Washington, who had spent 20 years in the SEAL teams and had seen things that would end, most people was asking with genuine concern in his voice whether someone was okay. I think, Beckett said carefully, that she is the most capable person on this mountain right now. Rome considered that, including us, including all of us. Rome was quiet for a moment. Well, he said finally, at least I feel okay about being saved by her. The QRF radio check came through Ghost's handset at the same moment that a figure appeared on the northern face of the ridge, moving down toward the valley with the deliberate, controlled movement of someone who was exhausted and injured, and absolutely refusing to show either of those things to the world. Riley Harper came down off Ridge 814 the same way she'd gone up, it alone without announcement, without ceremony. She was carrying the T-UNC 338 in her right hand, and her pack was still on her back, and her left arm had a dark stain on the sleeve that told a story she would minimize later when asked about it. She was limping slightly in a way that looked almost like a normal walking variation, unless you were trained to notice such things. And everyone in Beckett's element was trained to notice such things. She moved toward the QRF element's forward position, and as she came through, every one of the QRF operators stopped what they were doing and watched her. Not because they'd been told to watch, because when something that extraordinary moves through your space, your attention follows it without being asked. Ghost had the radio to his ear and was relaying position updates, but his eyes were on the figure coming down the ridge. Tiny had stopped checking his weapon and was watching. Doc Miller, who had seen everything and was moved by very little, had gone still in the middle of wrapping Brix's arm. Only Brix himself was not watching, because Doc was holding his arm in both hands and had told him in a tone that tolerated no argument to hold still. And Kevin Briscoe from rural Tennessee was many things, but he was not someone who argued with Doc Miller when Doc Miller used that tone. Beckett walked forward to meet her. He covered the distance between them without being aware he was deciding to cover it because some movements happened below the level of decision. She stopped when she saw him coming. She looked at him with eyes that were alert and assessing and showed the particular flatness of someone who had been in an extreme situation for the last half hour and had not yet allowed themselves to come out of it. The flatness would stay until she was somewhere safe enough to let it go. Beckett recognized it because he saw it in mirrors after the worst missions. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her arm. He looked at the rifle. He looked at her face. Ridge 814, he said. Yeah, she said. He extended his hand. She looked at it for one beat, just one, and then she took it and they shook hands in the way that people shake hands when words are insufficient and the gesture has to carry everything the words cannot. Thomas Beckett, he said. Riley Harper, she said. He held her gaze. How many? She knew what he was asking. She'd known he would ask it from the moment she'd started coming down off that ridge. She told him the number. Beckett nodded slowly the way a man nods when a number he hears confirms something he already suspected, but still needed to hear said out loud. Behind him, Rome had heard it. Hayes had heard it. Ghost, even with the radio handset pressed to his ear, had heard it. The number moved through the team quietly without comment, the way significant things move through groups of people who understand what significance actually costs. Overhead to the south came the sound that everyone in the valley had been waiting for since the first shots of the ambush, the distant, unmistakable sound of 10 thunderbolts dropping toward the deck. Air support had arrived. 22 minutes after it was supposed to, 7 minutes after Riley Harper had done most of the work it was supposed to do. Beckett looked up at the sound, then back at her. We're not done yet, he said. I know, she said. She raised the T-AC-338 and settled back into the professional stillness that was the only home she'd ever completely trusted. Tell them where you need it, The A-10s came in low and fast, and the sound of them was the most beautiful thing Thomas Beckett had heard in 31 minutes of the worst morning of his professional life. Two Thunderbolts call sign, Warthog 3-1 and 3-2 rolling in from the south with their 30mm GAU-8 cannons already spooled and their pilots already talking to Ghost on the close air support frequency. The sound the GAU-8 makes in operation is not a sound that translates well into description. It is something between a buzzsaw and a thunderclap compressed into a 2-second burst that sounds almost mechanical until you see what it does to the ground it touches. And then it sounds like exactly what it is, the most efficient killing instrument ever mounted on an aircraft. Ghost had the targeting data out before the Warthogs finished their first pass. He was calling grid coordinates in the flat, precise cadence of a man who had trained for this moment and was performing it exactly as trained, his voice carrying none of the injury or exhaustion or the 12 months of accumulated deployment stress that the rest of him was carrying. On the radio, Ghost was always exactly who he needed to be. Warthog 3-1 Kilo 4. Target is enemy personnel, open terrain grid follows. Friendlies are at my position, 150 meters south of target. Cleared hot on your discretion. How copy? Kilo 431 copies all. Tally on your position, rolling in. The first strafing run went through the center of the remaining enemy formation with a precision that left the battlefield a fundamentally different place than it had been 4 seconds before. The insurgent fighters who had been maintaining suppressive positions against Beckett's element, who had been coordinating and communicating and functioning as a unit under their commander's direction, were no longer coordinating or communicating. Some of them were no longer anything at all. The second pass went further east, cutting off the withdrawal route that the surviving fighters had begun using the moment the first pass ended. Warthog 3-2 came in from a different angle, denying the terrain that denial of terrain was designed to deny, and the result was a compression of the remaining enemy force into a geography that left them no good options. Beckett watched it from his position and felt something uncomplicate itself in his chest. Not relief came later after the threat was genuinely resolved. What he felt right now was the first loosening of the specific tension that had been squeezing him since Hayes had stopped moving in the darkness 3 hours before dawn, the tension of a man who has been running calculations that keep coming up wrong and has had to keep fighting anyway. The calculations were changing. For the first time in 31 minutes, they were changing in the right direction. Riley Harper was 40 meters to his right, prone the TAC 338, working the gaps between the air runs. She had understood without being told the rhythm of close air support. The runs came in with gaps between them. Gaps during which the aircraft were repositioning and the enemy was either running or reorganizing. And those gaps were when a precision shooter on the ground could do work that the aircraft couldn't. She was filling every gap. Beckett could hear the T. Act 338 between the engine noise of the Warthogs, that heavy deliberate crack, and with each shot he heard, he knew someone on the other end of the battlefield had made a decision they would not be making again. Doc Miller had gotten into her during the first repositioning pause, moving in that low, fast crouch that Doc used when he needed to cover ground without getting shot. He'd looked at her arm for approximately 6 seconds, said something to her that nobody else heard, and she'd said something back, and Doc had produced a field dressing from his kit and applied it in the time it took Beckett to scan his sector and look back. She hadn't stopped shooting while Doc worked on her arm. Doc hadn't asked her to. Afterward, crawling back to his position, Doc had passed close enough to Beckett for a 3-word assessment. Through and through, she's keeping it. Keeping it meant keeping the arm. Keeping the arm meant the wound was survivable without immediate surgery. Beckett filed that information in the column marked things that could have been worse and kept his attention on the battle. 34 minutes since the ambush triggered, 26 minutes since Riley Harper had appeared on Ridge 814 and changed the entire shape of the morning. The QRF element had established a blocking position to the northeast, cutting off the withdrawal route that the Warthogs hadn't closed. 12 additional operators had joined the fight, and their presence had changed the psychological weight of the situation even beyond their tactical contribution. There is something that happens to a team that has been fighting alone and at the edge of its capacity when reinforcement arrives. Not just the practical benefit of additional guns, but the confirmation that the world beyond the fight knows you exist, that you have not been forgotten, that the system works even when it takes longer than it should. The QRF team leader, a Ranger captain named Vasquez, had reached Beckett in the first minute of link-up, assessed the situation in 30 seconds, and integrated his element into the fight without requiring explanation or context. That was the thing about certain officers. They read a battlefield the way a musician reads a score, taking in the whole picture and knowing immediately what their part was supposed to be. Vasquez was that kind of officer. Beckett made a mental note to say so in his after-action report, assuming he lived to write one. He was becoming more optimistic about that by the minute, but the battle was not over. The insurgent commander, the voice that had ordered, "Kill every last one" with such confidence 40 minutes ago, was still alive. Ghost Linguist was still monitoring the enemy frequency, and what was coming through now was different from the confident tactical direction that had characterized the early phase of the ambush. The voice was harder now, compressed, stripped of the assurance that 50 fighters in a perfect L-shaped ambush had provided. But it was still giving orders, still adapting, still functioning. Linguist is picking up the commander. Ghost reported to Beckett during a brief pause between air runs. He's ordering his surviving elements to consolidate at the northern compound. Estimates suggest he still has 12 to 15 fighters with him. 12 to 15 from 50 plus in 40 minutes. Beckett did the arithmetic on that and understood immediately what it meant. The commander was pulling his remaining force together not for a continued assault that was over, and whoever this man was, he was tactically realistic enough to know it, but for a fighting withdrawal. He was going to move his remaining fighters north and disappear into the terrain, and if he succeeded, he would take with him the ability to reconstitute, to rebuild, to plan the next ambush against the next element of Americans who inserted into this province. "He's moving," Beckett said. "Yes," Ghost said. "We can't let him move." "No," Ghost said. "We cannot." Beckett found Vasquez. "I need to push north. The commander is consolidating and attempting withdrawal. Can you hold this position and maintain air coordination?" Vasquez looked at him with the eyes of a man who had been awake for 22 hours and was running on professional discipline and caffeine and the particular alertness that comes from having been in a firefight. "I can hold. How many are you taking?" Beckett looked at his team, Hayes limping on his last magazine but present, Rome out of SAW ammunition but carrying his sidearm and Tiny's backup rifle, Tiny wounded shoulder functional, Brick's left arm wrapped, right arm working, Ghost head wounds still on the radio, Doc who didn't fight but who would follow regardless. "My element," Beckett said. Vasquez started to say something about that. Beckett could see the objection forming: 6 people, multiple wounded, pursuing a consolidated enemy element of 12 to 15 fighters who were now motivated to survive rather than attack, which in some ways made them more dangerous. "And one more," Riley Harper said from directly behind Beckett. Both men turned. She was standing there with the T-Ace 338 across her body and Doc's field dressing white against the dark stain on her sleeve, and an expression that communicated with absolute economy that she was not offering this as a suggestion. Vasquez looked at Beckett. Beckett looked at Riley. "You don't have to," he started. "I know where he's going," she said. "I watched this ridge for 3 hours before you got here. I know every approach route, every natural choke point, every position that covers the northern withdrawal path." She paused one beat. "You don't." There was no arrogance in it. It was simply accurate the way a map is accurate, and arguing with a map because you don't like what it shows is a luxury that combat does not provide. "Stay on my right," Beckett said. She nodded once and was already moving. They went north in a formation that would have looked strange to anyone who didn't understand what they were: 6 battered, wounded, critically low on ammunition SEALs, and 1 Tier 1 sniper who had already been in contact twice in the last 40 minutes, moving in pursuit of a professional insurgent commander with a dozen fighters. What it looked like was a team. What it felt like from inside was something that Beckett would spend a long time trying to find words for and eventually stop trying because some things resist language. Riley moved them along a route that nobody else on the team would have found. Not because they weren't good enough, they were exceptional, all of them, but because she had spent 3 hours in the darkness studying this ground before any of them had arrived, and that 3 hours had given her a knowledge of the terrain that couldn't be transferred in a briefing, only in movement. She signaled route changes with her hand, and the team followed the signals without question, because her judgment had already been tested in the most definitive way possible and had not been found wanting. 4 minutes into the push north, Hayes touched Beckett's shoulder, 3 fingers pointing left. Movement 30 meters lateral. Beckett passed the signal forward to Riley. She already had the scope up. She'd seen it before Hayes had. She held up two fingers, two fighters' rear guard element, the commander's security. They were moving parallel, not toward, which meant they hadn't detected the pursuit. Yet. Beckett made the calculation in the compressed time that combat provides for calculations. They could go around, maintain pursuit of the main body, let the rear guard element continue without engagement. That was the tactically conservative choice. The problem with the tactically conservative choice was that a rear guard element that becomes aware of pursuit can alert the main body, and an alerted main body with a competent commander can set another ambush in terrain they know better than you do. He looked at Riley. She looked back at him. Something passed between them that was not words but functioned as communication anyway. She handled the rear guard. 2 shots, 2 seconds apart, so fast that the second shot arrived before the echo of the first had finished. Beckett heard it and kept moving, because that was what she'd communicated. I have this, keep moving, don't stop. He kept moving. 6 minutes north, 8 minutes. The ground was rising again, the terrain funneling them toward a natural choke point that Riley had warned them about with a gesture 4 minutes earlier, a narrow defile between 2 rock formations where a small force could hold against a larger one if they got there first. Ghost was on the radio. Linguist confirms the commander is moving through the northern defile. He has approximately 12 personnel. He believes he has broken contact. He hasn't, Riley said quietly from Beckett's right. No, Beckett said, he hasn't. Then Ghost's voice changed. The flatness that Ghost maintained in all situations shifted by a fraction that only someone who knew him well would detect, a fractional tightening that meant the information coming through his earpiece was significant. He held up a fist, stop, and everyone stopped. Chief, Ghost said, and his voice was careful in the way that careful voices are when they're managing something large. JOC is reporting a second element, separate from the main body. They've been monitoring the enemy frequency, and the commander has a reserve force. 12 fighters who were positioned north of the valley as a blocking element in case the original ambush failed to contain us. Beckett processed that. So the ambush had a contingency. Yes, and the reserve element is now moving south toward the defile. The defile, the natural choke point that the commander was using as his withdrawal route, which was about to become the meeting point between his retreating main body and his incoming reserve. If those 2 forces linked up in the default, they would have 24 fighters in a strong defensive position with good terrain and a commander who had already demonstrated he was skilled enough to set a textbook ambush and adapt when it failed. And Beckett's element had 7 people, multiple wounded, and enough ammunition between them for approximately 4 minutes of sustained engagement. That's the twist, Brix said quietly from Beckett's left. It was the first thing Brix had said in 11 minutes, which was unusual for Brix and indicated he'd been processing. The original ambush was never the whole plan. We were supposed to get pinned, take casualties, call for support, and when support pushed north to pursue, we'd walk into the reserve element. The original 50 fighters were the anvil. The 12 in the north are the hammer. Beckett looked at him and, yeah, he said, that's what this is. Professionally put together, Brix said. Agreed. Still going to get them killed, Brix added. Riley had been listening to all of this without expression. Now she spoke. How far out is the reserve element? Ghost checked. Linguist estimates 8 minutes. And the main body reaches the defile in 4 minutes, maybe less. She was quiet for 2 seconds. Then, I know a position above the defile. I identified it during my approach to the ridge. It covers both the northern entrance and the southern approach. If I'm in that position before either element arrives, I can control the default entirely. From how far? Beckett said. Close. Closer than I'd like. She paused. Maybe 300 meters. 300 meters with a T. AC 338 was not long range. It was the range where a precision sniper becomes something else. Something that operates in the space between sniper and close quarters fighter, where the margin for error compresses and the pace of engagement accelerates beyond what the instrument was designed for. It was the range where everything that could go wrong had a better chance of going wrong. How many magazines do you have? Beckett said. 3. He looked at her arm, at the field dressing, at her face which was giving him nothing. I'm going up there, she said. Not a request, not a question. I know, Beckett said. I need 4 minutes. He looked at his team. at Hayes in his shrapnel-torn leg, at Rome with his sidearm, at Tiny in his damaged shoulder, at Bricks in his wrapped forearm, at Ghost still bleeding quietly under his helmet, at Doc who would follow anywhere without fighting and would keep everyone alive after. "We'll give you 4 minutes," Beckett said. "We'll hold the southern approach. Whatever comes from the south doesn't get to the defile while you're in that position." She looked at him for 1 second. 2. The expression on her face shifted by something small, not softness, not sentiment, but something that acknowledged that what he was describing was a promise, and that she heard it as a promise, and that it mattered. 4 minutes, she said. She moved. She was up the slope and going in a time that made Bricks shake his head slowly, not in disbelief, but in the specific acknowledgement of someone watching excellence operate. "Positions," Beckett said. "South face. We hold until she's set." They moved into the terrain with what they had, which was not much but was arranged with the tactical precision of operators who had been doing this long enough to know how to make little go a long way. Beckett put Rome and his sidearm behind the largest rock formation, covering the most exposed approach angle. Hayes went left elevated, where his remaining rounds could do the most work from the best angle despite the leg. Tiny went right, same logic. Bricks took center with Beckett, and Ghost stayed mobile, linking the positions with the radio and the linguist and everything JOC could push them. 2 minutes passed. The silence was the kind of silence that has weight. "She's set," Riley's voice came over the emergency frequency. Calm, clear. "I have eyes on the defile. Northern element is visible 600 meters out. Moving fast." "Copy," Ghost transmitted back. "Southern element is your main body moving on your position in," he checked with the linguist. 2 minutes, 30 seconds. "Copy 2:30, she said. "Tell your people south of me whatever they hear, hold their position. I don't want anyone following me up here." Ghost looked at Beckett. Beckett nodded. "Understood." Ghost transmitted. "We hold." What happened in the next 9 minutes was not something any of them could see. They could only hear it, the TAC 338, speaking in that heavy, deliberate voice, first at the cadence of careful precision, shooting then faster as the range compressed and the situation developed. Then at a pace that told a story none of them had the angle to watch, but all of them could read through sound alone. The commander's main body entered the defile from the south and met something it had not prepared for. The reserve element approached from the north and found the same. For 9 minutes, Ridge 814's northern face belonged entirely to one person with 3 magazines and a rifle in a left arm that was bleeding through a field dressing, and the absolute refusal to let the mathematics of the situation determine the outcome. On the southern approach, Beckett's element held their position and listened and did not move because she had asked them not to move and they had promised. And Thomas Beckett was many things, but he was not someone who broke a promise in the field. Halfway through minute 6, a burst of close-range fire, not the TAC 338, something smaller. A sidearm came from the defile, and every person on the southern approach felt it in their chest, without being able to name what they felt. Bricks had gone very still. Rome's jaw was set so tight it was visible from 3 meters away. Hayes had stopped tracking his sector and was looking north with an expression that he would have denied later if anyone had mentioned it. Then the T, ASI 338 again. Once, twice, and then silence. 40 seconds of silence that lasted longer than 40 seconds should be able to last. Ridge 814 Kilo 4, status. Beckett's voice on the radio controlled, giving nothing away. 15 seconds. Ridge 814, come in. 20 seconds. Bricks looked at Beckett. Beckett looked at the radio. Ghost was already stepping forward to retransmit when the frequency crackled. Kilo 4. Her voice was different. Not broken, not even close to broken, but different in a way that told him the last 9 minutes had extracted something from her that the previous 40 had not quite reached. Defile is clear. Both elements neutralized. I am coming down. I need Doc. Beckett exhaled. It came out slower than he'd planned. Copy, he said. Doc is here. Come down slow. I'm coming down slow because I don't have another option right now, she said, and there was something at the edge of her voice that might have been dark humor, or might have been the sound of someone reminding themselves that they were still alive. She came down off the northern face 12 minutes later. She was upright, which mattered. She was carrying the rifle, which meant she hadn't needed to drop it. The sidearm was in her hand rather than holstered, which told a story about the last portion of what had happened in the D-file that she hadn't transmitted and that nobody asked her to tell. Doc was moving toward her before she reached flat ground. She let him come. That more than anything, more than the arm, more than the limp, more than the expression on her face, told Beckett how much the last 9 minutes had cost her. Riley Harper letting someone move toward her without stopping them was Riley Harper acknowledging she was human, and that acknowledgement was something she didn't make casually. Doc put his hands on her arm. He looked at the dressing. He looked at her face. He said something quietly that was just for her. She said something back that was just for him. He nodded and got to work, and she stood there and let him and the team stood around them in the way that teams stand when something significant has just happened and the significance hasn't finished arriving yet. Overhead, the warthogs were making a final pass over the D-fiche, confirming what the linguist on the enemy frequency was already reporting. The commander's radio had gone silent. The voice that had ordered "kill every last one" with such absolute confidence 71 minutes ago was not transmitting anymore. Beckett stood next to Riley while Doc worked on her arm and looked at the D-follow to the north and thought about all of it. About the briefing that had said 15 fighters. About the L-shaped ambush that had been 50. About the reserve element to the north that had been the real plan all along, the hammer, waiting for the anvil to do its work. About how none of them should be standing here. About how they were. "You knew about the reserve element," he said quietly. Not an accusation, a statement. She looked at him. "You were watching this valley for 3 hours before we inserted," he said. "You saw the setup. You knew the ambush had a contingency." She was quiet for a moment. "I suspected," she said. "The northern positioning didn't fit a pure ambush geometry. It was too far out to support the main effort if everything went according to plan. It only made sense as a contingency for if the main effort failed. And you didn't transmit that assessment." "I didn't have authorization to be monitoring your operation," she said. "I wasn't supposed to be here. I couldn't exactly call JOC and say I'd noticed something about an operation I wasn't supposed to know existed." Beckett absorbed that. The particular weight of operating in a world where doing the right thing and following the rules were not always the same thing, and where the consequences of choosing between them fell entirely on the person who made the choice. "So you came yourself," he said. "I came myself," she said. Doc finished with her arm and sat back and looked at her with an expression that was as close to respectful as Doc Miller's face was capable of producing, which was not a small thing. Beckett looked at his team, then back at her. "Riley Harper," he said. "Yeah," she said. "I'm going to need to know your commanding officer's name for my after-action report." Something crossed her face. Not quite a smile. Not quite. "That's going to be a complicated conversation," she said. "I expect so," Beckett said. "I'm planning to have it anyway." She looked at him for a moment. The morning light was fully arriving now. The darkness that had covered everything replaced by the particular flat clarity of Afghan dawn. And in that light, she looked exactly like what she was, someone who had spent the last hour and 20 minutes doing something extraordinary and was now simply standing in the aftermath of it, letting Doc Miller wrap her arm and waiting to see what came next. "Thank you," Beckett said, and he meant it with every part of himself that meant things. She looked at him for one beat. "You would have found a way," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but we didn't have to." The Chinook came in hard and fast the way extraction helicopters come in. When the zone isn't fully cold rotors beating the Afghan morning into submission, the crew chief already scanning sectors before the wheels touched dirt. It had been 1 hour and 43 minutes since the ambush triggered. It felt like a different lifetime. Beckett had his team staged and ready wounded first, then the rest in the order that gave them the best defensive posture during the most vulnerable 30 seconds of any ground operation, the seconds when you're moving from covered positions to an aircraft that can't wait and can't fully protect you. He'd done this 100 times. The choreography was in his muscles by now, not his head. What was not in his muscles was what to do about Riley Harper. She was standing 6 meters to his right, pack on her back, tack 3, 3/8, slung in Doc's fresh dressing, white and tight, on her left arm. She was watching the Chinook with the same flat professional assessment she applied to everything, cataloging it the way a person catalogs something that is relevant to their immediate situation. She had not asked about the extraction. She had not positioned herself with his team. She was standing in the particular way that people stand when they are waiting to see what happens next without assuming they're part of it. Beckett walked to her, She looked at him when he came close, and he could see it in her face, the thing she was doing, which was managing the transition from the sustained operational state she'd been in for the last 2 hours back toward whatever passed for normal. It was a transition he knew well. It was harder than the fighting sometimes. The fighting had rules, the transition had none. "You're on this bird," he said. She shook her head. "I have a vehicle 2 kilometers east, my original extraction point. I'll make it back through." "You'll make it back through the 2 kilometers of terrain that had 50-plus fighters in it 40 minutes ago," Beckett said. "On a compromised arm, alone." "I've done harder things in the last 2 hours," she said. "Yeah," he said, "you have. And that's exactly why you're getting on this bird." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking." Something shifted in her expression. Not resistance. She wasn't the kind of person whose resistance looked like resistance. It was something more considered than that. A recalculation, the look of someone who was used to operating entirely within their own judgment and was encountering with some surprise a judgment they were willing to defer to. "Your commanding officer is going to have questions," she said. "Yes," Beckett said. "So is yours." "Mine doesn't know I'm here." "I know," he said. "Get on the bird." She looked at him for one more second. Then she picked up her kit and walked toward the Chinook, and Beckett watched her go and felt something settle in him that he didn't try to name. The loading went fast. Tiny first Doc maintaining pressure on the shoulder wound during the movement. Brick's next left arm immobilized against his chest, moving with the careful efficiency of a man determined not to let an injury look like an injury. Ghost helmet still on covering the head wound that Doc had declared survivable, with a certainty that Doc applied to all his declarations. Hayes limping with a deliberateness that converted the limp into something almost like a stride. Rome, who had carried everything and expended everything, and was now running on nothing but the particular fuel that never quite runs out in men like him. Then Riley alone moving up the ramp with her rifle and her pack and her wrapped arm, and finding a position against the starboard side of the fuselage, where she sat with her back straight and her eyes forward. Beckett came up last. The crew chief looked at him, got his nod, and the ramp began to rise. The Chinook lifted with the stomach-dropping urgency of a helicopter crew that wants vertical separation between themselves and the ground as fast as physics will allow. The cabin was loud, the way Chinooks are always loud, a physical all-encompassing loudness that fills the space and makes conversation require either headsets or commitment. Nobody had headsets except the crew. So what happened in the first minutes of the flight happened in the context of that loudness, which meant it happened in looks and body language, in the particular vocabulary that people develop when they've been through something together and don't need words to carry the meaning. Rome looked at Riley from across the cabin. She looked back. He held her gaze for a moment, and then he nodded a single slow, deliberate nod that in Rome Washington's personal language meant something significant, and she received it without expression, but also without looking away, which was how she acknowledged significant things. Hayes was watching the deck between his boots, his jaw working slightly, the way it worked when he was processing something he hadn't finished processing yet. After about 90 seconds, he looked up at Riley and said loud enough to carry over the engine noise. "The left flank. When you hit the left flank first, how did you know that was the critical position?" She looked at him. "The L-shape degrades fastest at the corner," she said at the same volume. "Take the corner element and the perpendicular arm loses its coordination with the base of fire. It's the load-bearing point of the geometry." Hayes stared at her. Then he looked at Beckett. Then he looked back at his boots with the expression of a man who had just heard something that reorganized a portion of his understanding of his profession. "Yeah," he said mostly to himself. "Yeah, that's right." Tiny had his eyes closed, which meant either he was managing pain or he was managing everything else. And with Tiny, those two things were sometimes the same. But after a moment, he opened his eyes and looked across the cabin and said to nobody in particular, "I want to know how heavy that pack was." 80 pounds, Riley said. "Across how far?" 4 kilometers, mostly uphill. Tiny looked at his own wounded shoulder. Then he looked at Riley's wrapped arm, her pack still on her back because she hadn't taken it off yet, the rifle still slung across her body. He shook his head slowly. 80 pounds, he said in a tone that was not quite disbelief and not quite admiration, but existed somewhere between them. "Give or take," she said. Doc was working his way methodically through his patients in the order of clinical priority, which did not match the order of how loudly each patient was willing to complain. Bricks, who had the second most serious wound, was saying nothing and watching Riley with the quiet, assessing expression he used when he was categorizing something. Ghost, whose head wound Doc had already addressed twice, was on a crew headset trying to reach JOC with an updated situation report, because Ghost was Ghost and the radio didn't stop being the radio because the shooting had stopped. Beckett sat across from Riley and watched his team and thought. He was going to write an after-action report. That was not optional. After-action reports were never optional, especially after what this morning had been. He was going to sit down in front of a blank document, and he was going to account for everything that had happened, from insertion to extraction. Every decision, every contact, every casualty, every round expended, every moment where things went wrong, and every moment where something had intervened to keep them from going permanently wrong. And when he got to Riley Harper, he was going to have to decide what to say. He already knew what the institution would want him to say. The institution would want a clean operational picture, a coherent chain of command, a set of decisions and actions that fit within the authorized framework of what was supposed to happen in Zabul province on August 14, 2018. The institution was going to look at unknown Tier 1 sniper operating outside her authorized mission parameters, who inserted independently into a SEAL team operation and neutralized approximately 25 enemy fighters in 40 minutes. And the institution was going to have feelings about that. Complicated feelings. The kind of feelings that generate investigations and reviews, and the particular brand of institutional discomfort that arises when individual excellence refuses to stay within the lines that institutional structures draw. He looked at Riley. She was looking out the window, or rather looking at the side of the fuselage where a window would have been if Chinooks had windows there, which they didn't, which meant she was looking at the olive drab metal of the aircraft wall and seeing something that wasn't there. "What were you doing out here?" he said, loud enough for the engine noise. "Your original mission, before you heard us." She looked at him. Something in her face measured the question, measured him, made a determination. "Reconnaissance," she said. "Separate target, different valley 2 kilometers west." She paused. "I finished early." "You finished a 72-hour reconnaissance task early." "I work fast," she said. He almost smiled. "And then you were monitoring the emergency frequency." "I monitor the emergency frequency when I'm operating in a contested area," she said. "Standard personal protocol." "That's not a standard protocol." "It's mine," she said. He let that sit for a moment. Outside, the Chinook Afghanistan moved past in the form of sounds and sensations of altitude, changes the pilot adjusting course, the particular way the aircraft moved when it was trying to put terrain between itself and any remaining threats. The crew chief was doing his job with the focused calm of someone who had flown 100 of these extractions and treated professional calm as a form of protection for his passengers. "I'm going to recommend you for the Navy Cross," Beckett said. The effect on Riley Harper was immediate and not what he'd expected. Her expression didn't open up. It tightened, a specific kind of tightening that he recognized after a moment as the look of someone receiving information that creates problems rather than solving them. "Don't," she said. "What you did out there, Ed. What I did out there is going to be complicated enough without a formal recommendation," she said. Her voice was even, but there was something underneath it. "I broke my mission parameters. I operated in an unauthorized area. I inserted into an operation I had no authorization to be part of. A formal recommendation opens an investigation. The investigation looks at everything. Everything includes my original mission, which is classified at a level that..." She stopped. "It gets complicated." Beckett looked at her. "You saved 6 lives." "I know what I did," she said quietly, "and I would do it again. Exactly the same. Every decision the same." A pause. "That doesn't change the paperwork." The complicated truth of what she was describing settled over the cabin. Beckett had been in the military long enough to understand the gap that sometimes existed between what was right and what was manageable within the systems that surrounded it. He didn't like the gap. He had never liked it. But he had learned over 15 years that not liking it and being able to close it were different things. "What do you want me to do?" he said. She looked at him directly. "Write exactly what happened. Don't editorialize. Don't recommend. Let the facts carry it." She paused. The facts are enough. They're more than enough, he said. Then let them speak, she said. Ghost pulled the crew headset off one ear and turned to Beckett. JOC wants a preliminary count, Chief. They're asking about the unknown element on Ridge 814. He looked at Riley. They're asking if the element is aboard. Riley met Ghost's eyes. Ghost met hers. It was a moment of mutual recognition between two people who both understood what it meant to be the voice that held things together when everything was falling apart, and who both understood that the voice was always attached to a person, and the person always paid a price. Tell them the element is aboard and accounted for, Beckett said. Ghost nodded and went back to the headset. 30 seconds of cabin noise. Then Bricks, who had been silent for 11 minutes with the focused inner quality of a man organizing his thoughts, said, My daughters are 7 years old. Sir. He said it to the cabin in general, not to anyone specifically. He reached into the left breast pocket of his plate carrier and produced the photograph Claire Lily Rose in front of a house that was home in a way that Afghanistan would never be, and he looked at it for a moment and then he put it away. I was thinking about them when we were against that wall, he said, running out of ammo, thinking about Lily and Rose and whether they were going to know what happened. He looked at Riley. They're going to know their dad came home because of you. It was the longest speech Kevin Briscoe had made in any combat environment in Beckett's memory. And it cost him something to make it. Beckett could see the particular exposure that comes when a person who keeps their most important things private decides to make them briefly visible. He'd done it anyway. Riley looked at Bricks for a moment. Her expression did something small and real, something that wasn't performed and wasn't managed and was just human. Just the face of a person receiving something true from another person and letting it land. What are their names, she said. Lily and Rose, Bricks said. She nodded. She said the names quietly once, like she was filing them somewhere specific. Good names, she said. Claire picked them, Bricks said. I wanted to name them something tougher. Lily and Rose are tough names, Riley said. Bricks looked at her. Something crossed his face that was the closest thing to a smile that Thomas Briscoe produced in professional settings. Yeah, he said, they are. The Chinook began its descent. Bagram Airfield materialized in the senses of everyone aboard a change in engine pitch, a shift in the aircraft's attitude. The particular anticipatory quality of a landing, that means the immediate danger is over, and a different, slower kind of reckoning is beginning. Doc made his final pass through his patients. He stopped at Riley last. He looked at her arm. He looked at her face with the clinical directness he applied to everything. You're going to need surgery on that, he said. Not emergency surgery, but real surgery. The muscle involvement is more than the field dressing is handling. I know, she said. Today, he said. Not tomorrow. Today. I know, she said again. Doc held her gaze for a moment longer than the clinical requirement. Then he said in the voice he used when he was saying something he meant beyond its clinical content. You kept all of them alive. You understand that, every one of them. That's mine to say, because I'm the one who would have been dealing with the alternative, and there wasn't going to be a good alternative. He paused. I've been doing this for 14 years. What you did today, how you did it, I'm not going to forget it. She looked at him. The flatness that had covered her face through most of the flight had thinned. Not gone, it would take longer than a Chinook flight for it to go entirely, but thinned enough that what was underneath it was briefly visible. It was not what Beckett expected. It was not relief or pride or the satisfaction of a mission accomplished. It was something quieter and more complicated than any of those things. It was the face of someone who had spent years being exceptional in solitude, who had made decisions alone and carried them alone and operated in spaces where nobody was watching and nobody would know, and who was now sitting in a helicopter cabin surrounded by people who knew exactly what she had done and were telling her one at a time that it mattered. She nodded at Doc once. He nodded back and went to his kit. The wheels touched Bagram. The ramp came down. The morning light of the airfield, different from the mountain morning, flatter, more institutional, came in with the hot Afghan air, and the sound of the base replaced the sound of the engines, and the 6 SEALs and 1 Tier 1 sniper moved from the aircraft into whatever came next. Medical personnel were waiting. They moved toward Tiny first, then Bricks, then Ghost. Hayes waved off the first person who came toward him, and then Doc gave him a look that redirected his decision. Rome stood at the bottom of the ramp and looked at the sky for a moment, just the sky before he followed. Beckett was the last one off the ramp. He stood at the bottom of it and turned back, and Riley Harper was still inside, standing in the middle of the empty cabin with her pack and her rifle, looking at the space where his team had been sitting 30 seconds ago. He watched her. She didn't know he was watching yet. She was looking at the empty seats and doing something private with her face, something she wouldn't have allowed if she'd known she had an audience. Then she looked up and saw him. He didn't move away. He held the look. She came down the ramp. They stood at the bottom of it together for a moment in the Bagram, mourning the aircraft behind them and everything else ahead. What happens now, he said, not tactically, not operationally. He meant it the way it came out, the larger question, the one about what a person does after a morning like this one. She considered it seriously the way she considered everything. Now I go find my commanding officer and have the conversation I've been building toward for the last 2 hours, she said. And then I go get my arm fixed. And then she paused. I don't know what comes after that. I'll work it out. You'll work it out, he said. I usually do, she said. It was not arrogance. It was simply true, and both of them knew it. He looked at her. He had been trying since the Chinook lifted off to find the thing he wanted to say, the single sentence that carried the weight of what this morning had been, and what she had done in it, and what it meant to 6 people who were now alive, because she had heard a transmission and made a decision without authorization, and carried 80 pounds across 4 kilometers, and climbed a mountain, and fought 15 fighters, and then 12 more, and had come down off that ridge still standing. He hadn't found the sentence. He wasn't sure one existed. So he said the true thing instead, the smaller thing that was also the largest thing, my team is alive. She held his gaze. Yes, she said, they are. Because of you. She shook her head, not a denial or correction. Because of all of you, I was one piece. You were the piece that held all the other pieces together, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The Afghan morning moved around them, aircraft sounds, vehicle sounds, the noise of a base that was always working and always running, the machinery of a war that did not pause for any one morning, no matter how significant that morning had been. In the middle of all of it, 2 people stood at the bottom of a helicopter ramp and acknowledged each other across the distance of everything that had happened since before dawn. She extended her right hand. He took it. They shook hands the way they had shaken hands in the valley at the foot of Ridge 814 in the dust and the aftermath. The way people shake hands when the gesture has to carry everything that language cannot. Riley Harper, he said, because saying her name was the only way to make her real in the context of official record, to anchor her to the morning in a way that could not be classified or buried or reduced to an unattributed action in a footnote. Thomas Beckett, she said. She released his hand. She picked up her kit. She walked into the airfield, and the morning light took her, and she moved through it the way she moved through everything with purpose, without ceremony, leaving no trace of performance behind her. Beckett stood at the bottom of the ramp and watched her go until she was part of the crowd of the base and the crowd closed around her, and she was gone. Behind him, Rome Washington had come back from the medical station and was standing 3 meters away. He had seen the end of it. He stood next to Beckett, and they both looked at the space where she had been. She's not going to get the credit, Rome said. Quietly, not bitterly, Rome Washington had been in the military long enough to say true things without bitterness, because bitterness required surprise, and Rome was rarely surprised. The report's going to go and the classification's going to come down, and somewhere in a filing system that nobody looks at, there's going to be a reference to an unknown friendly element that assisted SEAL Team 4 in Zabul province. And that's going to be it. Probably, Beckett said. That bother you? Beckett thought about it honestly. Yes, he said, it does. Me too, Rome said. He was quiet for a moment. But she knows what she did. We know what she did. The guys in those 6 seats know what she did. He paused. That's not nothing. No, Beckett said. It's not nothing. What went into the classified report was exactly what Riley had asked for, facts, without editorialization, without recommendation, without the kind of framing that would generate the investigation, that would complicate the things that needed to not be complicated. The facts were, as she had said, enough, more than enough. They were a record that would sit in a classified system and be read by a small number of people with the right clearances, and those people would read what happened, and they would know. No public record, no ceremony, no acknowledgement in any forum that the people it would most mean something to would ever see. Only the facts waiting in a classified file. And 6 men who came home when the mathematics said they shouldn't have. And a name, Riley Harper, that lived in the memory of every one of them with the particular permanence of something that had been paid for in full on a morning in August in the mountains of Zabul province on a ridge that the official record called a grid coordinate and that Thomas Beckett for the rest of his life called Ridge 814. The place where one person heard a call for help and answered it with everything she had. The place where a ghost became real. And where 6 Americans learned that the most extraordinary things that happen in war are almost never the ones that get written down.